What makes a boss bad or good? It's something everyone probably has an opinion about. At the University of Iowa, there is someone that has made this his life's work. It's one part business school, one part applied psychology, and a lot of really great insights into human nature. His most cited paper to date discusses transformational leadership, a subject which we sat down to discuss. Dr. Courtright, welcome. Please introduce yourself and what you do.
Absolutely. So, Stephen Courtright, I'm the Henry B. Tippie Research Professor and Director of Executive Education at the University of Iowa's Tippie College of Business. I study bad bosses and dysfunctional teams, and I figure out how to correct both of those.
Is there current research that you're working on that you want to talk about or share?
Yeah. A lot of the current research that I have going on really relates probably less to like the outright kind of, what you might consider like deviant or immoral type of leader behaviors. Like I'm just yelling and screaming at my employees. I'm calling them blatantly incompetent. I'm undermining them, but more at just sort of like the behaviors that maybe aren't morally wrong, but just aren't good behaviors. So things, for example, like micromanagement, or things like I get ghosted by my leader when I offer an idea or I offer up a concern. I retreat from my leadership, duties or obligations. I sort of just again stop communicating in a sense. So again, a little bit more maybe the benign, but certainly the behaviors that employees complain about a lot with their bosses, and actually happen on from what we've seen so far, a more frequent basis than the kind of real negative, destructive type of behaviors that I've studied previously.
The two things that you look at, it sounds like, are kind of the abusive bosses
Hmm.
and micromanagers. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Yep, absolutely. And I really started in the abusive part in large part because I saw from a number of individuals that I was either close to or people that I was talking with, students and others, just how destructive that abusive supervision was. When you go into work and you honestly, what it feels like is it feels like harassment. It feels like that you're constantly on guard. And frankly, those who are victims of abusive supervision exhibit a lot of similar symptoms like PTSD and others, and they're more prone to alcoholism. They're more prone to having family issues. And so I looked at abusive supervision as much of a societal issue as it was a productivity and business issue, and that we could actually solve, at least in part, some of society's problems by just bringing more humanity to leadership and leadership in corporate and in other spaces. And one of those ways was to just sort of talk about what were the downsides of abusive supervision. But more than that, a lot of my research was on what causes it, what makes people be abusive supervisors. And if we can discover the root causes, can we then address the issue rather than just telling people don't be abusive? Let's actually figure out what's causing them to be abusive and then kind of address that. And so that's been much of my research in the abusive supervision.
Do you find that like abusive tendencies in the workplace are different in various sectors?
Yes, absolutely. So we find the highest base rates, not surprisingly, military and athletics, and that there's a little bit more of kind of this norm around those. And that's not certainly not the only sectors. This phenomenon cuts across different industries, but there's just a little bit more sort of norms for tolerance of those behaviors in those kinds of industries relative to others. And so that actually plays a big role, is what are the organizational norms or what are the industry norms? And that kind of gets to what the overarching philosophy of my research has been, which is that I look less at how people are raised or what are some of their natural personality traits. And I look a little bit more like these accidental abusive supervisors, those that really don't intend necessarily to be that way, but can kind of transform into that kind of boss. And so I've looked primarily at kind of three factors along those lines, or really actually two factors, and then one that I've been looking into, if you will, more currently. and that are a little bit more around the accidental part. So accident one is kind of the situation, and I can go into more detail on that, but it's exactly what you mentioned. There's sometimes just these situational factors that make it more likely where we're going to be abusive, even if that's not what we set out to be or even really want to be as leaders. Number two is well-being, and so looking at people's level of burnout has been a topic of mine, and looking at, in its essence, kind of how that burnout from factors both outside the workplace as well as inside the workplace are affecting our ability to be able to control our emotions, kind of regulate our aggressive impulses, and what happens when how does it occur basically that people become abusive when they are unable to do those things because of factors. So again, I kind of look at it as an accidental phenomenon. I know that's not the whole picture, but it is a picture that we need to realize, because the implication is that any one of us can be that way. Any one of us can be abusive. And I think it's more fruitful to talk about that, so that then we can't solve personality as well. And we can't solve how people were raised, but we can solve that problem. We can solve a few problems that create accidental abusive bosses.
It sounds like the abusive boss creates more of a toxic environment, but also the micromanager also creates a toxic environment.
Yes, and the toxic environments can feel perhaps just a little bit different, but they are both what you might call toxic. And toxic is a hard term because it can be, if we're not careful with toxic, I think it can encompass anything and everything that's bad. And so this is sort of even the way that I put it. And I don't know if this is actually even the right terminology, but this is the way I oftentimes put it: is there's good environments, there's bad environments, and there's ugly environments. And when I talk about the abusive kind of supervision, that can most often create this really ugly environment, the kind of environment where everybody's sort of looking out for themselves, everybody's sort of walking on eggshells around the supervisor, around each other. And it's just such an unhealthy environment that, yeah, we do find that people are leaving work and they're more likely to engage in addictive behaviors, and their families are affected by it. That's the really ugly environment. The micromanagement was what I can call kind of a bad environment, where people don't feel trusted, where they don't feel valued, and that has its own implications. And those implications can be bad for the organization, for the supervisor, for the employee, but they don't reach that point of real ugliness where we're saying, like, this is a societal issue as much as it is an organizational issue. So I like to distinguish those two, be kind of the good, bad, and ugly of environments. And I usually put micromanagement under sort of that bad environment.
Are you, maybe even just personally, but are you looking at today's leaders of, large companies and the people who are in headlines and seeing who might fall? You might, even if you don't have personal experience with them, or are you looking for anecdotes to say, do they fall into good micromanagers or abusive?
Yeah. I obviously do. And one of the reasons I do is because, as a teacher of this and as a presenter and kind of a consultant on this, I'm always looking for those high profile cases that people are familiar with. So I absolutely look for those. But honestly, when I do my research, when I study, I actually study everyday bosses. I am studying people that work in everyday kind of industries and organizations, because what I don't always want to focus on are the outliers, because I think that there's some danger in focusing on the outliers. And let me just give you one example of that. So I have heard, for example, when I've talked about abusive supervision, I oftentimes will hear a comment something like this: I get that abusive supervision is bad, but how do you explain the Steve Jobs, or how do you explain former Indiana basketball coach Bobby Knight, or a number of different lists that we can add of people we can add on there who are high profile, extremely successful, even revolutionary transformational leaders who are also abusive? They say, well, how do you explain that? And so this is what I use to explain that. I say there was this study that was done, and it was done by some consultants, and they looked at the performance ratings of about 50,000 different supervisors. So a very large sample from a scientific perspective. And what they wanted to look at is, they wanted to look at what was the probability of somebody who is in the lower quartile of what they kind of called interpersonal performance. In other words, they sort of got along with people, they managed conflict well, they weren't abusive. What's the the probability of someone being in the lower quartile on that being ranked in the upper quartile of overall just leader effectiveness and leader job performance. So they had this large data set of 50,000 people, and they found 20 people who fit that. 20 of 50,000. So or 25, excuse me. So my message is always this: it happens, but I want to hedge my bets. And if it's a 1 in 2,000 probability that I can be a Steve Jobs or that I can be a Bobby Knight, that's not a good enough odds for me. I would much rather be on the positive side of those odds and be able to say, like, again, have the odds in my favor, where if I don't do those things, my probability for effectiveness increases significantly. So that's one reason why I don't focus so much on sort of the more famous cases, because I think they can sometimes be construed as outliers, which is exactly what those individuals are. I like to focus on what have I found in my on my research on, and I don't know if this is the right term, it's the term I use, everyday managers like me,
Right.
you, others,
Right.
who are managing organizations in a lot of different industries, and we're not getting on the headlines for it necessarily.
What about examples of great bosses?
Yeah. I mean, in that sense, we can use a lot of those examples too. But this is also where I find the benefit of science to be, and that is not to negate the importance of reading biographies. I actually have one of my hobbies, because I'm a nerd, is to read presidential biographies. So I've started at Washington, and I'm making my way through all the presidential biographies. I love learning about the experiences and the struggles and the triumphs and the failures of great leaders. And I frequently pull those out as anecdotes in my consulting work or in my teaching. I've even used them in my written research as well, where I'll say, "Hey, we got this idea from this little anecdote," and that can be with good bosses, that can be with bad bosses, depending on which on the study. That said, what I think the benefit of science is that we're not pulling from one person's experience. We're looking at a huge samples, and we are looking at variance, because in the end, I don't want to know just what good leaders do. I want to know what bad leaders do, and I want to see that variance, and I want to see what explains that variance between the so-called good and the bad leaders. And that's what science really does, is we explain variance, and we do that in large samples. And so when I talk and I speak on these subjects, I'm always going back to the science, because it's reflective. The samples are reflective of people like me or people that I'm speaking with, but it also helps explain that variance much better than just an anecdote can do.
So what do you find in the science of good bosses that reflects maybe the anecdotes?
And this is a huge question, because the literature is massive. There's literally thousands of studies on this, but let me give you a very quick, I wouldn't even say 35,000 foot view. This is like looking from the moon down to the earth.
That would be great.
But I'll give you the gist of it. Yeah. I think the most common way to think about this is there's this notion of transformational leadership, which is kind of this big bucket of just really good, effective leader behaviors. And so one of those that the leaders do is they are able to inspire with vision. I talk about this as really effectively setting direction. So they're able to inspire with vision. And another one is that they're very good at communicating those ideas and sort of being sort of this ideal influence, if you will, of what of the vision that the leader is trying to communicate. So sort of exemplifying what you're trying to do. But the other part of it is this notion of just being good with people. So I give individualized consideration to people, and I'm able to inspire them based on where they're at. So in kind of the setting direction, the engaging people, and finally that you're really inspiring people to go above and beyond just what the group or the team is doing right now, but toward a higher, loftier vision. And so kind of this change-oriented leadership. So to summarize those, I put them in kind of three buckets: these setting direction, the ability to be able to inspire with vision, the ability to be able to connect with people, and the ability then to be able to use that vision and those relationships to bring people to a whole new state that is different, that addresses the needs of the future, and that really helps people to feel more secure about the future in a sense too. So hopefully that helps those kind of three buckets.
Do you have some anecdotes or examples of people currently existing CEOs of, famous people that we see in the news, maybe that you think fall into that do those three things?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different examples I think of this. And I will say, anytime you use an anecdote, there will always be people who will say, well, yeah, but that wasn't my experience, or this wasn't my
Right,
experience, right?
right.
But I'll give you one example, and that is that I've just been following. That's Ed Bastian at Delta Airlines. So when Ed
Mhm.
Bastian took over, Delta Airlines was just really, really struggling, and they were struggling with customer service. They were struggling with a whole lot of different things, massive turnover and layoffs and strikes. And he is I shouldn't say single-handedly, but as CEO, he has established a culture where now Delta is really looked at as one of the premier airlines. It's looked at as one of the more premier experiences that you get. And that's not to suggest, again, anytime I use an anecdote, I always have someone say, yeah, but I had
Right.
this terrible experience on
Yeah.
Delta.
Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Ed Bastian has transformed an organization. And a lot of that has come because he's not only inspired a new vision that's very sort of, cutting edge and customer focused, but the first thing he did is he went around to all the different sites and just met personally with all the different employees and in groups, and he got to know them, and he made himself very known and visible in the company. Um, Almost kind of, and some people will be cynical about this and say, well, he made himself into a celebrity CEO. And I get that some of that exists, but also as a CEO, you are the figurehead, and your employees need to see you. And so he really positioned himself as being visible and being available. And so it's really transformed Delta in the last several years.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.